I am reading out of Speaking from the Heart, Ethics, Reincarnation and What It Means to be Human by and also about Joan Marshall Grant. She was an author and she wrote books about her previous lives. This is chapter 10 I am reading now. The title of the whole part of this book is Psychiatry and Past Lives, and we are here in the body-soul duality, and I continue reading in this chapter. Touch is only one of the senses that are neglected. How many of us, unless we are artists by inclination or profession, bother to make full use of our eyes? Of course we use them to read newspapers and to avoid being run over by a bus. But ask the average person you meet what aspects of beauty he can vividly recall having seen during the past week. Even if he has driven through lovely scenery, he has probably seen very little except the car in front. How many people assiduously seek for pleasure through their eyes or teach children how to do so? This is easier to do in the country or by the sea. But even in the city, there are museums and picture galleries and buildings of soaring lines or interesting roofscapes, lights reflecting in wet pavements and the shapes of clouds. And even in the most uninspiring room, it is usually possible to provide oneself with a flower and really to look at it, which to do at all effectively takes at least 20 minutes. It is extraordinary how seldom even keen-sighted people amuse themselves through their eyes. I was walking with two friends recently when I stopped to watch an ant's nest. They stopped too, and in a few minutes one of them asked whether I was still feeling faint. They had not even noticed the ants. However, they got the message, for the next time we arrived to visit them, their son, aged 4, was lying face downwards on the lawn. His mother called to him, and he looked up only long enough to whisper urgently, "Shush, I'm very busy watching a worm." Hearing is the least neglected of all our senses, which is surprising considering what our ears have to endure. Traffic and telephone bells and the parrot house of conversation in a crowded room. But our ears not only have the benison of music, but when we are fortunate to find ourselves in such surroundings, the more subtle pleasures of listening to small sounds on a still night. With a little patience, one can almost feel one's ears listening to the rustle of a leaf, the sough of a wind in long grass, the plink of a frog, a note quite distinct to the frog answering it from further down the valley. Our sense of taste, except by a few connoisseurs of wine and food, is so seldom intelligently extended that it has become almost atrophied. This is particularly foolish, for in addition to the pleasures we miss, we deprive ourselves of a personalized guide as to what we should and should not eat. For instinct can advise us to what we need to maintain our health far better. For instinct can advise us as to what we need to maintain our health far better than can a diet sheet. This is why I think there are few more repellent sights than an adult forcing or cajoling a child to eat something which he is instinctively trying to reject. For if that child, from the time he was old enough to indicate his preference, was offered a selection of suitable types of food and allowed to choose both the type and the quantity of nourishment that his body at that particular juncture needed, he would undoubtedly be very much more healthy. Even a child who has been deprived of his ability to choose wisely can have his taste buds re-educated, a process which takes a certain amount of courage and patience, but is most beneficial. Again, this is not just a theory, it works. Among the children who lived with me during the war were 5 who were supposed to be martyrs to bilious attacks and indigestion. Each arrived with a diet sheet which portrayed the fact that every mouthful they ate was poisoned by fear. fear that they should be ill if they failed to eat enough of some particular item, fear that they would be ill if they were so much as nibbled at another. Fear is always unhealthy, so I tore up the diet sheets and announced that they could choose to eat as much or as little of anything which happened to be available. I then added that this regime would begin as soon as they had learned how to vomit at will, which, after about an hour's demonstration and instruction from me, they could all do with minimal inconvenience. This technique came in handy during the early stages when a couple of them ate an enormous surfeit of unripe plums, which both children got rid of at the first twinge of discomfort, instead of letting them have time to produce a painful colic. 2 others hoped to draw attention to themselves by engaging in a hunger strike, but I managed to conceal my secret twinges of anxiety. They ate perfectly normal after publicly fasting for 3 days. This experiment took place over 20 years ago, and it is interesting that none of the children concerned ever subsequently suffered from digestive troubles. And even more rewarding, all these children brought up with proper respect for their instinct have shared this benign immunity. I would be almost as reluctant to discard the use of my nose as I would be to discard the faculties of my ears. For my nose affords me many acute pleasures, of which the most endearing is the smell of healthy bodies which mine find congenial. Adult bodies, children's bodies, animals' bodies, even infant bodies, if these are free of an undertone of regurgitated milk. One of the more dismal aspects of the present attitude towards noses is, if one may judge by advertisements for deodorants, that it now seems taken for granted that the best a body can achieve is to smell of nothing at all. My nose also provides me with a great deal of useful information. Like most other animals, I can smell fear, which is an entirely specific smell, musky and slightly acrid, which can be a useful clue when trying to decide whether a piece of offbeat behavior is motivated by tiresome aggression or only by acute anxiety. A discreet sniff will often tell one more about a patient's progress than will a glance at his temperature chart, and some diseases have a characteristic smell, which can be an important aid to diagnosis. An example of the diagnosis angle occurred while I was recording a life in 16th century Italy, which later published as Life as Carola, who was earning her living by playing a lute with 3 other strolling players, was nursing one of them, a woman called Lucia, through smallpox. Carola was in the stable loft of an inn, a few days on foot from Perugia in the summer of 1526. The stench of Lucia's disease was so nauseating that on 5 separate occasions I had to rush from the room to vomit. My secretary, though identifying with me, started to smell it too and had to break off taking dictation to obey a similar precipitate reaction. She was still in the bathroom when the doorbell rang, so I answered it to find a stranger on the doorstep. He identified himself as a doctor who had come to visit a friend who was convalescing with me after an operation, and then exclaimed that he had better do something for me before he saw her, as I was obviously feeling ill. Being still more or less on 2 levels at once, instead of dissembling, as I would normally have done, I said frankly, "Oh, there's nothing wrong with me. I have been reliving a 16th century smallpox, and the smell is so disgusting that I can't get it out of my nose." He accepted my statement calmly, put down his bowler hat and umbrella, and followed me into the drawing room. He then asked me to describe the signs and progress of the disease, which I proceeded to do so, with a wealth of unsavory detail which has been deleted from the published version. When I had finished, he told me that my description of each stage of the disease and its duration was extraordinarily accurate, and that in fact the only point on which he could fault me was when I claimed that smallpox had a specific and unforgettable smell. But it has, I can still smell it, I exclaimed with some heat, to which he replied soothingly, I'm not suggesting that there would not have been attendant disgusting smells, especially when the patient was being nursed under such primitive conditions, but there is no diagnosis one. I can't state this categorically, but I have but recently returned from India, where I spent 2 years at the M.O. in charge of the smallpox ward. I did not see him again for 6 weeks. This time he came to show me an article in a medical journal which had come in the Morning Post. It described a case of rare type of smallpox, which had been rampant in Europe during the 16th century, but was now almost unknown. A sentence had been underlined in red by the doctor. This type of smallpox can easily be distinguished from all other types, for the patient exudes a specific stench, which, once smelt, can never be confused with any other. I have recounted this incident at some length because it illustrates how the experience of one body can affect another in the same serious. It is relevant that although Joan suffered nausea, just as Carola had often done while she was nursing Lucia, Joan did not suffer from symptoms of fear. This was because Carola did not catch smallpox. Her supraphysical body had no personal experience and therefore no dread of the disease. For the supraphysical records only what has actually happened. It remains unaffected by the thought forms of anxiety, which are created by the other part of the body-soul duality. One has many supraphysical bodies and should be able to choose which of the series is most suitable for any particular extra three-dimensional activity. For instance, at the outbreak of the First World War, I was a child of 7, so Joan's supraphysical body would not have been a suitable one in which to explain to soldiers who had just been killed that they were now living on a different level of consciousness. So I used one or other of my earlier supraphysicals, a female aged about 25, if I thought it best to appear as a Red Cross nurse, or a slightly more mature male when I wished to be mistaken for a stretcher bearer or a doctor. The supraphysical bodies were real. The clothes they wore were thought forms based on photographs which Joan had studied in illustrated magazines. One should also have several supraphysicals belonging to each incarnation, for these are not only fun to use, but are useful when talking to people of different age groups. They should be easily recognizable, but can have minor improvements on the physical model. For instance, my teenager Joan has straight teeth. Young adult Joan has long, thick hair instead of wearing a false plate. Fully mature Joan has grey hair and wrinkles, but she still has long eyelashes and her stomach remains elegantly flat. Another advantage of having more than one active current supraphysical is that this makes it easier to appear in 2 places at once. An example of this mechanism occurred while I was living in Wales during the war, and although astral projection is a well-known phenomenon, this personal experience of it may be of interest. I was driving home one evening when I suddenly remembered that the doctor's wife, whom I will call Lydia, was in the cottage hospital, because the following morning she was to have a cesarean for the birth of her 2nd child. So I took her some flowers and gossiped for a few minutes, but only about trivialities. I had only met her a couple of times, had never discussed any of my ideas with her, nor had she read any of my books. I knew, because her husband has told me, that the birth of her first child had been hazardous. After 3 days in labour, she had had an emergency caesarean, which was followed by a paralytic ileus, a dangerous complication from which she nearly died. Her husband's present anxiety was increased by the fact that she was terrified of being given an anaesthetic, and always suffered from violent vomiting after ether. This was before pentosal was in general use. The following morning I was engaged in one of my periodic bouts of rearranging furniture, With the assistance of 3 gardeners, I had taken a large bookcase to pieces, so that I could move it into another room, when I suddenly noticed that it was 11 o'clock. Lydia's operation was scheduled for noon, so I thought of her intently for 2 or 3 minutes, visualizing her in the hospital room, which had a French window opening on the garden. Then I asked that someone should keep a friendly eye on her, especially before and during the anesthetic. I did not consciously think of her again that morning, and the only slightly unusual incident was that I was startled when the luncheon gong rang, for I thought it was only 11:30 instead of 1 o'clock. That evening the doctor called at the house to thank me for being of inestimable help to his wife. He told me that at 11 o'clock he had left her alone, as though, although she was very agitated, he felt that his presence was only making her worse. But when he came back to take her to the theatre, he found her perfectly tranquil, even drowsy, which amazed him, for she had no premedication, as she reacted badly to morphia. She told him that after he had left the room, I walked into it through the French window, and had sat by her bed, chatting so entertainingly that she had forgotten to be frightened. She seemed surprised that the doctor had not seen me, as I had only just left, after assuring her that she would feel so sleepy before she reached the theatre that she would need very little anesthetic. The baby would be fine, that she would not feel even a twinge of nausea when she came round, and so have no more pain, and could be fixed with a couple of aspirins. This is exactly what had transpired, a benign series of events, which the doctor thought was due to my powers of suggestion. He even thanked me for being so tactful as to visit Lydia by using the garden entrance, so avoiding the dragon of a matron who would have refused to let me see her. So I think I'll finish this for now, and I continue this chapter at a later time.